So, Dark Crisis, DC's latest, biggest summer event, finally came to an end a few weeks ago in the winter. I know I actually planned to make this video way sooner, but you know, Christmas and the holidays kind of got in the way. But because so many of you really seem to like my more long-form, more pointed solo podcast video I did digging deeper into the story that was Marvel's Judgment Day, I thought it would be a lot of fun to come back and do it again. Think of it as a listenable fireside chat between you and me, only our conversation is kind of one-sided. I mean, you could talk back, it's just I'm not going to be able to hear you. Honestly, going into making this video, I wasn't sure what to say because Dark Crisis, later renamed Dark Crisis on Infinite Earths for reasons that will become very apparent later on, is one of those events where a lot of stuff happened and yet I felt like nothing really happened. Which, don't get me wrong, in and of itself isn't necessarily a bad thing. Clearly Joshua Williamson had a vision in mind for this event. He said in interviews many times he wanted Dark Crisis to honor and pay homage to every era in DC Comics, from the newer modern stuff to the Golden Age and beyond, and for what it's worth, I think he did ultimately manage to accomplish that in this story. It's just that the road to ultimately get to that destination was bumpy to say the least. Now, to properly talk about Dark Crisis like any other similar DC storyline, I just can't start at the beginning of Dark Crisis. Oh no, I gotta go all the way back and explain multiple other stories as to properly set the stage. And you know what, people say comics and superheroes are sometimes hard to get into, am I right? Which to me is funny on its face because I actually read a comment only a few days ago that said they really appreciated Dark Crisis because it was so easy to read and get into and there wasn't a lot of preamble or tie-ins like Judgment Day had, even though that might have been true when the guy wrote that, it certainly didn't end up being true by the end. So with all that in mind, let's get down to the real nitty-gritty of it all. The first seeds of Dark Crisis were actually planted in the pages of Infinite Frontier, a mini-series from Joshua Williamson that dropped in 2021. This story tried its hardest to clean up after the events of the last big universe-reshaping Crisis event, Dark Knight's Metal. Yes, that's right, Dark Crisis is a story that picks up at the end of one DC Crisis storyline and runs directly into another special Crisis event. DC, my guys, I love you, but I really think you have a problem with crises. You are horribly addicted. I really don't want to have to start checking your arms in between your toes every 5 to 8 years anymore. You'll remember at the end of Dark Knight's Metal that Wonder Woman defeated the Batman Who Laughs and made it so every DC hero could finally remember their entire publication history thanks to the creation of the Omniverse, even though this mostly proved to be an empty promise that didn't amount to much in the long run, as most writers didn't even take advantage of this very cool concept. Hell, Wonder Woman herself didn't even seem to remember or care that she used to be clay for way longer than she was ever a demigod. You know what, if they're not doing another Wonder Woman movie, can we at least retcon that back to how it used to be? You know what, I digress, I went on a tangent there. To reward Diana for a job well done, the Quintessence, the ultimate cosmic ruling body of the DC universe, made up of such powerful beings as the Phantom Stranger, Hera, Ganthet, and the Spectre, decided to make Wonder Woman a god. Well, actually, that's not 100% true. They promised her godhood at the end of the Scott Snyder story, and then in Infinite Frontier #0, they kinda ended up downgrading their offer to little less than actual godhood. That story ended with the members of the Quintessence being murdered by Darkseid on Omega World, a brand new planet that existed outside of the brand new Omniverse. Darkseid wasn't just regular Darkseid either, but a souped up true Darkseid who unlocked the full breadth of his powers after the universe changed. These events would end up kicking off a much bigger storyline involving a multiversal conspiracy wherein villains from other Earths joined forces with the true Darkseid to try and protect themselves from the constant rewriting of the DC universe whenever a new crisis happened. Yes, that's right, you heard me everyone, characters within DC Comics are actively sick of crises and how it upends their lives. This story had several prominent side plots, one involving Roy Harper and Psycho Pirate becoming new Omega Lanterns in service to Darkseid, the resurrection of the Golden Age JSA, as well as several other major Earth 2 adjacent characters like Mr. Bones and even the original Cameron Chase. Even Power Girl found her way out of the literal hole that DC editorial had kinda stuck her in for a number of years. Now for the bad guys' plan to work, they need to sacrifice Barry Allen in order to drink up all his sweet, sweet special multiversal energy, and I mean it makes sense, right? Because of the classic Flash of Two Earths story that basically ended up popping the bottle on the crisis trend that we're all living with even now. It was during the big final battle of this story between the good guys and the bad guys that Barry Allen the Flash ended up disappearing into a place called Multiverse 2, aka all that remained of the old DC universe that was destroyed back during the events of the original Crisis on Infinite Earths. Yes, I know some of you have already gone cross-eyed, but I promise stick with me and this will make sense by the end. It was there in Multiverse 2 that the Flash came face-to-face with Pariah, one of the central characters from the original Crisis on Infinite Earths story. You'll also remember that Pariah was the one responsible for the destruction of the original Infinite Earths. Keep that in mind because it will be important later. Pariah explains to Barry and the reader that Omega Earth isn't a regular planetoid, it's actually part of a much bigger and much older threat that almost destroyed the universe once before, in the future. You see, Omega Earth was actually part of the Great Darkness, a metaphysical evil force first seen in the pages of the famous Legion of Superheroes storyline, The Great Darkness Saga. Only, wait, though, not really, because right at the end of Dark Crisis, they do a total takesy-backsy and say that what they were dealing with was only a small piece of the Great Darkness and not the real thing. Such an odd choice to throw in right at the end, if you ask me. Barry ends up getting locked away in a sweet little paradise dimension that Pariah describes as the world as it should be. Yes, once again, we had a Crisis villain whose whole raison d'etre seemed to be telling the reader that the stories they were enjoying were not as good as they thought they were, and definitely not as good as they used to be. Kind of funny how this keeps happening, right? Don't worry though, this is actually about as metatextual as the story gets. In fact, I give this book all the credit in the world for not being another DC Crisis story that ends up getting bogged down and hitting double meanings. In fact, it's probably the most straightforward, what you see is what you get Crisis story, and geez, I don't even know how long at this point. Now, that's where Infinite Frontier ends, but the bigger storyline gets picked up again a year later in the pages of Justice League Incarnate, once again written by Joshua Williamson. In this story, the House of Heroes, made up of Justice League members from across the multiverse, including President Superman, Calvin Ellis, and even Thomas Wayne from the Flashpoint universe, go out into the greater multiverse to try and save Barry Allen, but also to try and close a series of dangerous cracks that are beginning to form within the multiverse itself. The idea being that Darkseid made these cracks in the multiverse with the Flash's power so he could try and steal the might of the Great Darkness for himself, only it's not just him going after it. A ton of different villains from different universes want that power, including, get this, the Empty Hand, the big Lovecraftian mega-villain from Grant Morrison's story Multiversity, which fittingly enough saw the debut of many of the Justice League Incarnate characters we follow in this one. I'll freely admit, of the whole Dark Crisis trilogy, this middle part is actually probably my favorite one, and it makes me sad that the Justice League Incarnate characters basically fall off the face of the earth when this one is done. The other big and probably most important thing about Justice League Incarnate is that it's this story that Joshua Williamson sees fit to rewrite and recontextualize the entire origin of the DC universe. Yes, I know that's usually something that comes at the end of a Crisis event, but here he did it in the middle, just, you know, throwing the rules out the window, I tell ya. In this new creation myth, the Great Darkness has always been there since the beginning of all time, and that every other Crisis villain, whether they knew it or not, were actually secretly doing the bidding of the Great Darkness by trying to return the Omniverse to nothingness. Yes, and I mean everyone from the Anti-Monitor to Extant actually were being influenced by the Great Darkness, but not Perpetua though, of the Metal Wars. That big bad from Dark Knight's Metal just kinda wasn't invited to the party. Which to me I found personally funny because she's literally the only woman villain in all of these Crisis stories, and when all the bad guys get together in the big dark army shot, it's one giant sausage fest. It doesn't stop there either. Joshua Williamson even goes as far as to imply that the heroes losing all those years of their lives in the New 52, becoming grim and gritty, was itself to blame on the Great Darkness, nudging along Dr. Manhattan to mess with time the way he did. But get this, turns out the Great Darkness isn't even inherently evil like everyone assumed, it just craves nothingness like it had at the beginning of all things. Ultimately, Darkseid and Justice League Incarnate are defeated by the Empty Hand, who gets his hands on those cracks, which, hey, just so happens to look like the Flash's own lightning bolt. That's a fun touch. With no options left, the House of Heroes finally seeks the help of the Earth Prime Justice League, which in turn actually takes us to the start of Dark Crisis. Yes, that's right, I've been talking for almost 10 minutes and that was all prelude. We're not even at Dark Crisis yet. I suppose in a way that is kind of the big blessing and curse of Dark Crisis as a story. You could know everything I just said about the backstory going in and appreciate the main event even more, but even if you didn't, the main storyline is very simple. Good guys versus bad guys, with the fate of the entire universe hanging in the balance that anyone could pick up and follow along with if they wanted. I just kind of personally can't shake the feeling that the most interesting stuff in Dark Crisis happened before Dark Crisis actually started. So the Justice League go to aid the House of Heroes, but all they end up doing is getting themselves himself killed by Pariah in a fashion very similar to how Barry Allen himself was unmade by the Anti-Monitor back in that big event story. This is also where Joshua Williamson comes aboard and starts writing the main Justice League book, and they made a big deal in the press about how, like, oh, the first thing he's gonna do is kill the whole Justice League. But of course, they're not really dead. Anyone who's been reading comics for longer than a few minutes could already have told you that one. Pariah just put them all into their own little dream dimensions, much like he did the Flash, so he could siphon off their power to help him bring back the infinite Earths. In fact, some of these Dream Earths all get their own little one-shot tie-ins. Some are pretty good reads, but none of them are what I would call actually necessary to reading Dark Crisis, a problem I will cover later when I talk more about the tie-ins. Now, you might be thinking to yourself too, is Dark Crisis just Crisis on Infinite Earths but in reverse? And yeah, honestly, it kind of is. Pariah actually is pretty sympathetic as a villain here in this one, just wanting to undo the worst thing he ever did at all costs. Though, as we find out later, Pariah isn't actually doing the bidding of the Great Darkness. Instead, he somehow managed to corrupt the Great Darkness with his own madness and turn it away from its original goals of seeking nothingness. Now, while the main Justice League may have gotten Total Party killed, it turns out that there actually was one leaker who managed to get away, and it's none other than Black Adam. Yes, Black Adam joined the team back during the early days of the Brian Michael Bendis Justice League run, no doubt to help raise his profile and create synergy for the brand new Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson Black Adam movie. And Dark Crisis as a story sure works overtime to give Black Adam this real important central role in the story, with him trying to overcome survivor's guilt, though mostly all that means is he just floats around from different parts of the story to other parts of the story, and getting in the faces of all the characters who are actually out there trying to do something. That is, of course, until the final moments wherein he has to risk it all and actually share his amazing Shazam powers with the rest of the heroes. It's actually a really awesome image, by the way, and it's a real shame that it's only a single page of all the DC heroes getting their own Black Adam makeover. Kind of a waste if you ask me. That premise really deserved a whole story to itself. I truly think Black Adam being given such a place of prominence in this event storyline is going to look really funny to future readers revisiting this story, considering the big fallout that happened with the movie that this was all trying to connect to. I mean, obviously none of it is DC Comics' fault or Joshua Williams' fault. They were just doing what they thought was the right thing. They didn't know that the movie was going to underperform, or that the star was going to lie about box office returns, or that he was going to get another star to walk away from a successful paying Netflix gig on nothing more than a promise. I just think it's going to be one of those things that ends up instantly dating this story. Hell, it just ended and that part already feels incredibly dated to me. It gets even better too, because literally once the threat has passed, Black Adam just looks at Superman and his son and goes, "Yep, I'm off to newer, better adventures, everyone. Adventures that I'm certain aren't going to come now." Now, the meat and potatoes of this story that is Dark Crisis is that with the League seemingly dead and gone, heroes like Nightwing and Wally West, Flash try and rise to the occasion and help protect Earth, while the newer, younger heroes like Jonathan Kent and the Superman try and recruit a brand new Justice League to fill the void left behind. I feel like the second part of that story was probably meant to be a lot bigger once upon a time, before they canceled that Yara Flor Wonder Woman book much too early, and before they more or less gave up trying to promote that Jace Fox Batman book, which is still going, by the way. Those two and this whole like proto-trinity are in the beginning of the story and at the end of the story, so if you're a fan, you will feel served, maybe just not in the way you want it to be. They also try and set up a weird kind of superhero generation gap storyline, with Williamson seeking to explore the idea that Nightwing and Flash aren't scared at all because they've lived through multiple crisis events before, and they know that the heroes have died before and they're almost certainly coming back, while the young heroes like John and the others, for them this is their first time and they're taking it all super seriously. That plotline also doesn't have much in the way of a resolution either, now that I stop and think about it. If nothing else, it does serve as a great excuse to showcase a number of new heroes who have books on sale right now who don't always get the spotlight, though honestly the air gets taken out of the sails kind of quick when Alan Scott and the Justice Society of America show up. If only because it's like, hey, wait, why were we worried that we lost our premier super team? We have a perfectly good super team right over here. They're just, older. Again, I get it. The plan was to highlight and pay homage to every era in DC Comics, past, present, and future, and you certainly can't do that without the Golden Age heroes. And they really only just came back to prominence because of the events of Infinite Frontier. Or, I don't know, maybe because much like in real life, young people have a hard time calling their grandparents and asking for help, or just calling their grandparents in general. Now, standing in our hero's way is actually Deathstroke the Terminator, who, following his own death in the pages of Shadow War, yes, another Joshua Williamson book you needed to read to get the full breadth of Dark Crisis, Slade was reborn as a thrall to the Great Darkness and Pariah. Williamson was writing that Deathstroke solo book, and I get the distinct feeling that he really likes Deathstroke more than most people do and goes out of his way to try and make him sympathetic at times when I don't really think he deserves it. He spends 90% of this story twirling his metaphorical mustache and claiming that I'm going to destroy all of superhero-dom by cutting out the heart of legacy, before eventually going, oh no, actually I think the world would be better as a place filled with nothingness because there would be no superheroes, no supervillains, and my children couldn't get hurt anymore, even though, I'm the one hurting my children. Deathstroke also brutalizes Beast Boy in this story and blows up the new Titan's Tower, but beyond that, he doesn't really do much. His body count is very, very low, all things considered, with only Green Arrow staying dead by the end of this story, but naturally, he's not staying dead forever because Joshua Williamson is going to be writing his new solo series coming very soon, and we know he's alive and well in that. There also comes a point in this story, too, where Slade goes from being Pariah's lackey to the host of the Great Darkness himself when Pariah is ultimately defeated, which is a shame because Pariah and his motives were probably the most interesting, most compelling, most juicy thing about this story, and when he leaves the narrative, a lot of the drama ends up leaving with him. For what it's worth, though, Pariah actually does end up ultimately succeeding in his plans to bring back the Infinite Earths, which is kinda cool in and of itself that he's like the only one in this who actually got what he wanted. I think Dark Crisis itself could probably be best described as a big, huge, star-studded blockbuster finale to years worth of storyline. Stories that, as I said before, I found more interesting and more complex than what we were given here, and by the time that the good guys and the bad guys all decide to line up on the same field and fight one another, I really couldn't complain that much because I know that I was essentially watching a big elevated Saturday morning cartoon. Dick Grayson ends up probably walking away from this one looking the best. It was clear that they really wanted to focus on Nightwing, as he, as the first sidekick, basically represented this idea of superhero legacy. It all kind of starts with him. And I mean, yeah, can't complain about that. Dick Grayson is a fan favorite for a reason, and I think it's something that a lot of people are going to be able to enjoy about this book, even years from now. Now, what DC comic event would be complete without tie-ins? Dark Crisis had about a dozen, and I would say none of them really mattered to the overall plot. There was those Justice League Dream World one-shots that I mentioned before. There was a totally infuriating and utterly disposable Young Justice reunion book that actually ended up having nothing to do with the Great Darkness at all, but by God was it a fascinating train wreck of a book that I think is going to live long after the events of Dark Crisis have disappeared from people's minds, if only because the panels from this book are going to be taken out of context for decades to come. I just know it. They also made a really odd publishing choice by trying to sneak in like 5 other tie-ins under the radar between the penultimate issue and the finale. Mostly these existed just to try and get over the new Red Canary, a character who will no doubt be a much bigger fixture over in Joshua Williamson's Green Arrow book when that comes out. I know the comic press really ran with talking about this character, which makes it even more hilarious that we don't learn her name and she doesn't even have any superpowers when you do read the tie-ins about her. Really only the Flash and Green Lantern books had meaningful tie-ins to Dark Crisis, but you know what? I didn't read them and I didn't feel lost at all when it came to actually reading the main storyline. In fact, the book gets you up to speed pretty quick on everything that happened in those tie-ins. Perhaps my biggest personal gripe with Dark Crisis as a story is a complaint that I honestly haven't heard anywhere else, and that is the idea that the book doesn't bother to explain why the Infinite Earths returning is even a bad thing. Like, sure, they maybe once make passing reference to the fact that the Earths are unstable and that they could explode, but they never really sold me as a reader on why any of it was a problem. Or for that matter, they never sold me on why this big sea change in the DC universe was important or even good. Yeah, sure, there's some room to tell more out-of-continuity stories now on other Earths, but with Black Label and all of these other DC imprints they've been collecting over the years, it's not like they were really having a problem telling DC stories out of continuity or anything, were they? At best, it felt like nostalgia chasing. At worst, it felt like maybe a creator personal pet project, like, oh, I remember when there were Infinite Earths and I want to bring them back because that's what the world is missing. By the end of Dark Crisis, it's implied that Barry Allen as the Flash is going to go and investigate the new Earths because in his words, the universe is now a crime scene. This probably means we're going to get a Barry spin-off book to accompany the Wally book that's already on shelves right now, and you know what? Hey, Flash fans, you guys are long-suffering, you guys deserve some love, let's throw you a bone. In fact, let's throw you two. Green Lantern Hal Jordan also says in the aftermath of the final battle that he wants to try and give living on Earth a try again, as he's missed far too much. Again, not a bad pitch for a new book that I'm sure hasn't been announced yet. Personally, I've always liked and respected the Green Lantern family of books, but I've found them to be a little bit impenetrable the last couple years. Maybe this'll change that, who knows. But perhaps the biggest post-event stinger for Dark Crisis involves Batman and Nightwing. After the Justice League make it back to Earth and help save the day, they agree that maybe the League as a group should lay dormant for a bit until they can find a new, better mission statement for themselves. They also want Dick to lead the superhero community into a brand new era, seeing how much good he did under pressure. And I mean, yeah, any story that elevates Dick Grayson as a character and gives Nightwing some long overdue love is naturally going to go over well with the bigger fan base. Dick leading a new incarnation of the Justice League feels like one of those things that probably should have happened forever ago. Though part of me does wonder how long this new status quo can last for. It feels like they've tried to up Nightwing's profile and give him more responsibility in the greater DC universe before, but usually they always return to status quo. And yeah, that's basically all there is to say about what happened with Dark Crisis as an event. I thought it had its ups and its downs, but mostly I walked away from it feeling positively. I'm not going to sit here and say that it's my favorite DC Crisis story or anything, but it stuck together, it wasn't a chore to read, and it was refreshing to see how it focused on characters outside the traditional Justice League and Trinity set. In fact, it's probably exactly because of that I'm actually much more forgiving of this story and its shortcomings, and personally I'm invested to see where the DC Universe is going to go without maybe having a traditional Justice League for a little bit. I mean, we're definitely going to have a big team book. It, at most, might just not be called Justice League. So yeah, that'll just about do it for me in another video, everyone. I hope you like these longer form looks into events and comic storylines. If you do, I'll probably come back and do it again. In fact, I might be doing it sooner rather than later because Dark Crisis ended with a big tease for Lazarus Planet, the next big Mark Waid-centric event. So until we inevitably end up doing that video, I've been CapedJoel, and I will see you all again next time, everyone. Bye-bye.